Welcome back to this episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews, and my special guest today is, an old friend of mine who is the country head of the Commonwealth Bank here in Japan, Martin Spann. Welcome to the show, Martin.
Thank you very much.
So, actually, Martin, I'm just trying to remember now. I was country head of National Australia Bank. Were you just entering Japan as country head at that time? Did we overlap?
I started this role in 2010, September 2010, but was previously here with other banks in different roles prior to that.
So I think we may have, I left in 2010, so we may have been a little bit of slight overlap as country heads of two Australian banks here in Japan. But tell us a little bit about, how it turned out that you came to Japan in the first place.
Well, I first came to Japan in 93, and that was really as a, to learn Japanese, because I'd graduated from uni in 1991. If you remember, the economy in Australia at that time was pretty bad. It was a recession. And I started to get a bit of a strategy together in my head. What can I do? Being in Australia, I wasn't getting anywhere. I was working, but it wasn't a job that was going to get me. It didn't have a career, was my concern.
Were you, which uni, and were you in banking you talking about?
Yep, so I went to Bond University. So I was the
Gold Coast,
inaugural intake in the undergrad at Bond University with a finance major. And again, Bond had that Japan connection as well, because it was Alan Bond and EIE who were the initial partners for the university. So, and there were some Japanese students there, and also some friends of mine who graduated. They took a year off and came to Japan, and that got me interested. And I thought, well, okay, I've got a finance degree. If I can speak Japanese, and the Japanese banks at that time were strong as they are now, I thought the combination of finance degree and Japanese skills would get me a good job and a career in banking. And here I am in 2020, country head of CBA. So, I think I've been lucky.
That.
Yeah.
So when you first graduated, did you work in Australia before you came up to Japan, or how did that work?
Yeah, well, I graduated and I was working in Brisbane. It wasn't in finance, which was my preferred career. And it was really, it was a small company, more marketing and sales related. And, I guess I didn't enjoy the role and I didn't see a career there. And that's why I made the move to come over here. I was here for maybe 10 months, learnt Japanese.
So you came here on your own dime,
Yep.
No scholarships, no support. I'm here, I'm going to enroll myself in a Japanese program and spend my money to educate myself, basically.
Exactly, yeah.
Well done.
Yep.
And so you spent 10 months here, and by that time you started to get somewhere with the Japanese. Did you do Japanese in your finance degree at all at Bond?
No, I didn't do any language at university. And, in the 10 months I was here, my Japanese got pretty good, and I thought it was pretty good, but obviously it takes a lot longer than 10 months to get good language skills. But the smart thing I did was when I went back to Australia, I continued studying. And I ended up getting my first job in finance with State Street, Trust Bank.
So when you say went back and you kept on studying, was this formal study or individual personal study?
Well, it was basically going to a Japanese school. So I would register and go to a Japanese school, make efforts to, be involved in the Japanese community in Sydney. I mean, the interesting thing was I went back and applied for a job with State Street, went for the job interview, and it was for a portfolio accountant. And I went for the job interview and they rang me up the week later and said, Martin, thank you for coming in for the job. You didn't get it. A week after that, they called me again and they said, hey, Martin, we're after a portfolio accountant who can speak Japanese. And I had, obviously the Japanese, a bit of Japanese skill. I had the finance degree and I got the job. And that was my first job in finance, was the State Street in Sydney in their Japanese division as a portfolio accountant.
Great. And then how did you get yourself back up to Japan?
Well, I actually asked for a transfer with State Street, and unfortunately at the time I was unable to get a transfer to Japan because the job I was doing was centred in Australia, and I think after that they actually moved those roles up to Japan. So the timing didn't quite work for me there, and I actually, again, I quit and basically come up to Tokyo, and this is giving my age away a little bit, but applied for a job in the Japan Times. Of one of 150 people, and got a job with, at the time, BZW Securities as a futures and options broker.
So what you're saying is there was an ad in the Japan Times that you saw, a job ad,
Yes.
and you applied for it on that basis. So you come up, you've got no job in hand. Again, you just turn up here looking for a job, see the job ad in the Japan Times, apply for it, and then you got that job.
Got the job, yeah. And again, it was a combination of some language skills, some experience in banking and finance from State Street, and the degree. So,
what was the company you joined in Japan? The first job in that job?
Well, BZW Securities, which is now Barclays Capital.
Now Barclays Capital.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. And what were you doing in that job?
Well, basically, I was a futures and options broker. So I used to broker JGB, so the Japanese Government Bond futures and options, and also the Euro-Yen interest rate futures and options in Japan.
So at what point did you get into a leadership role in Japan?
Well, the leadership role, probably came in the early 2000s when I left Barclays and I started up the Japanese Government Bond Repo desk at one of the German securities firms in Tokyo. And, I had people reporting to me then, so it was in the early 2000s.
Right. And this is your first time to be leading a Japanese team, I presume? The Japanese or international, or what was it?
It was Japanese. But it was mostly, on the trading floor, was mostly foreigners. And most of the Japanese on that particular trading floor were relatively, westernized, I guess.
Yeah.
And
so was it a smooth transition? Suddenly you're now the boss, you're leading these Japanese staff. Was it all like, oh, this is easy?
Well, it was a relatively smooth transition, I think, and the staff numbers initially weren't great. I mean, I started with one person reporting to me, so it's not like you've got 20 people. But, people by nature are complex, I guess, which is one of the challenges of management, to ensure that you're clear in messaging and hitting the right notes in the message with the people you're managing and all those types of things. And you certainly need to give thought to those types of things in the day-to-day interaction with people, I think.
So, Martin, your first major leadership role with a large volume of people started here in the Commonwealth Bank?
Yes. Yeah.
Right, okay. And so how long had the Commonwealth Bank been in Japan by the time you arrived?
Well, the Commonwealth Bank's been here since 1986. Prior to me starting here in 2010, the focus was retail banking. Mm-hmm. That's not my background. My background is, like a money markets background. And that was the business that they wanted to build in Japan.
So retail banking in that sense means foreign currency accounts, housing loans, that type of thing we're doing for Australians or whoever living here who want to trade currency or buy property in Australia, presumably, right?
Yeah.
And then things changed, I guess?
Yep. Essentially that business went into rundown mode. So there was no new business being done. We had to shrink staff around that because there was staff supporting the retail business initially. That as new business doesn't continue, there's obviously less people are required.
That's a big stress point, though. You're the newly appointed head, and one of your first jobs is to transition the banking content away from retail, and therefore you're basically letting people go. So that must have been quite challenging from a leadership point of view.
Yeah, and I guess I was lucky from the perspective of a lot of the transitioning had been done prior to me starting. And, there was people working and leaving at different points in the future as the business ran off. As an example, the real estate valuer and the credit team and different people like that. Some of the roles were able to transition into other parts of the bank. Some were not.
But they knew that. They'd been given ample warning that, hey, we're changing the focus. This role is going to disappear.
Yeah.
We'll try and find another role for you, but if we can't, you will disappear. And so you're just sort of following that along then, I guess.
Essentially, yes.
Right. So what were some of the challenges you found then? I mean, as a new head of an existing bank, been here a long time, you're the new head. What was some of the things you found was a bit difficult or challenging?
Well, I guess the first thing is you come in and nobody knows you. Maybe they know your history in banking, but essentially you've got to get credibility with the people you work with. I found that I was able to do that by, getting some initial small wins by, as an example, a very simple example, increasing some trading limits and credit limits and different things like that. Obviously, I'm helping the traders do their role by make it easier for them by increasing limits. Is a very simple example of getting credibility with the traders, which enables them to, take a larger position, to take advantage of market, movements and things like that. So I think by helping people do their job or making it easier for people to do their job gives a leader credibility in the eyes of the people of the staff. That's something I've tried to maintain during, my time with the bank here.
When you're downsizing, it's hard to bring in your own team. Like for a lot of leaders, they go into a new company, they will bring in people or hire people from outside who is really their team as sort of a backup, a help to assist them to run the business. But I guess, did you have that option, or you were actually the other way, you're actually losing people?
Well, the main core of people that were here when I joined are still here, and there has been some people that move as the business changes or they decide to move on or whatever, but the main core of people remain. I didn't bring in any teams into the bank. That really wasn't required. So it's really replacing individuals as required. I think early on it was very critical to make the right hiring decisions. And I know that hiring in Japan is sometimes viewed by people outside of Japan as something that is very important, because often moving somebody on that doesn't work out can be a challenge in Japan as compared to other countries in Asia, where I think it can be, it's less challenging.
And what were some of the things you found were also challenging? Okay, you understand that you can give the traders some help with limits and you're giving some support to get credibility, but you've got a core team of people who've been here a long time, and you're the latest version of the boss, from Australia, presumably, most of them. How do you go around sort of winning those people over?
The people in
the existing team, your existing leadership team.
In Japan, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's a combination. Well, one thing that I've found is important is to, do what you say you're going to do and have a consistent message. So I'll say to people, this is what I'm going to do, and I'll make sure that I deliver on it. And it sounds very simple, but I think it's a very powerful message that, if you consistently do it, people know that you will deliver on what you say. And if they, believe that you will deliver on what you say, that gives you credibility with them, and they believe you. And that's, can be a powerful part of managing people.
There's also a degree of predictability too, and I think, particularly in Japan, Japanese don't like unpredictable events or unpredictable people. They like to know, okay, it's going to be like this, so they can then get their head around that and fit in nicely. So having someone who's consistent and predictable gives a bit of safety, I think.
I agree, and I think the fact that I've spent a lot of time in Japan as well and understand how Japan works gives staff comfort that I'm not, I know how things work in Japan, and I'm prepared to ensure that, maybe some things we change a little bit in Japan to, accommodate for the cultural differences here. And I think that's also appreciated by staff.
You talked before about communication as well. So, how did you go communicating your messages? Because often bosses anywhere, they think, well, I told everybody. I've told them, they know. But what you then usually find out is they may have heard it, but they're not doing anything about it, or they actually didn't really hear it. So how did you go about communicating your messages so that it actually resonated and things you wanted to happen actually happened?
Well, I guess there's usually layering of messages within the bank. So the CEO may come out with a message that is then, there's a repeat of that message at my group executive level. And then I will take that message and maybe tailor it a little bit more to the branch at our level and relate it to what's going on in the branch. So the consistency of messaging across the bank is important. And as the manager relaying the message gets closer to the branch, it should get a little more tailored to Japan or whatever part of Asia the message is going to, that it becomes more meaningful to the staff. So I think that's something that I've tried to do here. And also...
Well, how are you doing that? Were you doing it through type of town halls or one-on-ones?
So we'd often have a town hall. So there might be a messaging going out on an email, and then we'll have a town hall about it and we can discuss it. Often we also have town halls when we have senior managers come to Tokyo, and people can ask senior managers questions, which I think is also quite good for staff, where they can ask questions about strategy or whatever's they want to find out about.
Japan's notorious for no one asking any questions when these things.
Yes.
The VIPs come, they're all deadly silent. Right?
Yes. And
so how do you get around that problem?
Well, I usually have some questions that I kick things off with, and give the staff a big heads up of a couple of weeks for questions, and tease them a little bit about asking questions because they're not good at doing it. But luckily we've got a couple of people who usually come up with some questions. So generally speaking, it works okay. But in Japan, if you do have a question time, you certainly need to, be aware of the cultural differences or the reserved nature of Japanese not necessarily wanting to ask questions.
There's nothing like having a big shot come into town and it's question time and it's like total silence. Yes. The whole atmosphere dies, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and how do you know that, when you're communicating your messages through your middle management, that they're in turn passing that down? Because in Japan, a lot of times the core of middle management are often like a big sponge, They love getting information from above, but they're very miserly in passing the message down, especially around the why of things, right? So how do you make sure that the key messaging is actually going right from top to bottom?
Well, I have regular catch-ups with my mid-level managers here, so the guys that have people reporting to them. And, we'll talk about, messaging if required, but generally speaking, they're quite good at ensuring that the message gets through to staff. Sometimes we'll talk about the messaging in our regular catch-ups and how it should be presented. Other times, the messaging does come from head office, depending on what the subject will be, that, the messaging does come to me and managers below me of, here's the message that we're delivering to staff at this point in time in relation to this matter. So it can sometimes be dictated by head office, other times not.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. And, in big companies like yours, you've got how many people here?
We've got around 20 people in the
20
office.
20 people here. And Commonwealth Bank globally would have how many people working for it?
It's like 45,000.
45,000, right? It's a big company. And so they've got branches outside of Japan as well and outside of Australia. So often they have, big companies have staff satisfaction surveys or engagement surveys. Do you have those sorts of things here for the Japanese staff?
Yes, we do. And that's a global survey.
Initiative, right?
Yeah.
Same survey, global.
Yeah.
So how have you found that? Because often, in my experience, the global results come out and, APAC as a region is usually scoring a bit lower than everywhere else. And then within APAC, the lower scores are usually Japan. And then you get a lot of pushback from HR at headquarters about why you're doing such a bad job leading people in Japan because they're obviously not engaged or motivated. How's your experience been with those scores?
Well, to be honest, initially the scores in Japan were actually quite good.
Were they?
And I think that was more to do with the Japanese people answering the questions thinking that they had to give good answers. So, they were... do you enjoy your job? Yes, I do. It's, answering it the way they thought that management wanted it to be answered. And then that became obvious, not just in Japan, but in other countries. And the message from management then became, we want you to be truthful in these surveys, because if there's a problem, we need to recognise, number one, that there's a problem. That's not going to happen if you're not truthful in the surveys. And once we understand there's a problem, we can address the problem. And that's what this survey is all about.
That's ironic because for most companies, they've got a very low score. They're trying to get it up. You've got a high score trying to get it down.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so in recent times, the scores have been lower. But, as a result, we do, the management team here do work together and get feedback from staff in relation to the issues that have been identified. We do talk about how to resolve them. Some things we can resolve at the Japan country level, other things we can't. But sometimes we'll group with other parts of Asia to make it a more powerful block to actually get changes done if there's common problems. So there's different ways to attack the problems like that. And by doing that, I think staff see there are changes. And again, that's another powerful message to staff that, if there's an issue and they raise it with management will have an action to try and address it. We're not always successful, but, we always do have actions.
And so how did you go about communicating that we want some truthful answers? That implies you've all been lying and we don't trust your answers and now we want you to tell us the truth. That's a bit of a complex message to get across.
Well, I guess, no one was accused of lying. I think they were, maybe, trying to present, I guess in Japan, it's an analogy I often use is, Japan is like the swan. Above the surface, it's all elegant and everything is beautiful and nice, but underneath there's quite a lot of things going on. So, and that was the case a little bit here, I think, that they were trying to present an image of Japan as being nothing to see here. Everything's fine. But obviously, there's always issues, there's things that we can do better. And that's the message we gave was, tell us what we can do better and we'll try and fix it. And I guess that was the message, that you don't need to present to us that everything is perfect. We know it's not. Let's identify some problems and work together to resolve them.
And did you find that it took a while for them to respond on that? Because often with these sorts of things, Japanese are pretty cautious. They'll sort of test the system a little bit to see if there's any repercussions before they'll go any further, rather than sort of jumping in and saying, okay, now I'll be truthful and tell you what's wrong.
Yeah, and, again, with a relatively small number of staff, people are also concerned about, not being identified as the person who said A, B or C in a survey. But I guess over the years, people do understand that the survey, no one knows what the answers, who gave what answer. We do get verbatim responses that are reviewed, but no one knows who submitted those. So it is totally anonymous and people understood that. And again, the messaging over a couple of years that we want to know what's going on, got through and I think we're getting better responses than what we used to.
So if we think about, say, you talked before about getting credibility through bringing things to the team that you could do, like expanding the rates or limitations on it, etc. But trust is a key element of business in Japan. So how do you generate that degree of trust in the team to follow you as the leader?
Well, I think, trust gets back to a little bit to what I was talking about before about the, doing what you say you're going to do builds trust. I think also having success for the branch builds trust, and people see success and they think that, success is good for everybody and it reflects well on everybody in the branch. And, we have had some successes. We've also had some challenges. For example, the earthquake in 2011 was a big challenge for me as a leader to be, leading a team in a time that was challenging from the perspective of there was so much misinformation in the market.
So did you stay or did you go?
Yeah, no, I stayed. And
that's a big deal because, you've got the French government and the German government instructing their nationals to leave Japan because they're worried about nuclear, cloud, etc. And the Japanese can't leave. They're here. And then your expat bosses are on a plane and they're out of there, or have gone to Osaka or something. So I think those who actually stuck with the team and stayed, that shows a difference in terms of commitment and loyalty to the team that I think maybe in other cases, companies, they didn't see that from their leaders.
Well, I thought as a leader, if I wasn't here, I couldn't continue to lead the people because, you can't leave the team in Tokyo and then go back to the safety of Australia and run things from there. But, I was lucky enough to identify that there was a lot of misinformation and to also identify some good sources of information which we're able to rely on. I also didn't think it was credible that BBC reporters are near Fukushima reporting on it, saying that it's bad, the sky is falling type of reporting. If it was that bad, they wouldn't be there, was what I thought. So a combination of having credible sources of information, support from head office, to access other sources of credible information, enable me to make some good decisions. We moved to, some of the team to Osaka very early to get people away from Tokyo because we didn't know what was going on. And there was good engagement from the team and input. And as a leader, I took it on board, and actioned it. That resulted in, the Osaka, temporary office and a skeleton staff in Tokyo. And we said to other people, you should leave Tokyo because if we were to evacuate from Tokyo, you couldn't evacuate because there's so many people you wouldn't be able to leave.
You wouldn't be able to get out, yeah. And what other things do you do to build trust? For example, are you taking staff out for drinks? Do you have lunches? Do you, go to izakaya and have a big night? Or how do you build that trust with individuals?
Yeah, I think, having, lunches or drinks is always a good thing to do with staff. We probably don't do it as much as we used to because expenses are a little bit more scrutinised than what they used to be within the industry as a whole, I guess. But that's certainly a good way. But even just having catch-ups with people. I have regular catch-ups with a number of the managers here and just talk about how things are going, what can I do to help, and having those sorts of catch-ups, I think is helpful.
And what about the people below them, sort of like the front line inverted commas, but the people that are sort of, the coalface there? Do you ever interact directly with them, or is it always through middle management?
No, I try and interact with everyone. I mean, we're not a large office here, so I know everybody and make an effort to say good morning to everyone in the morning and stuff like that. So I guess that's a simple thing, but knowing people and being able to talk to them and have a conversation about what's going on in their role with them, I think is important. And, I try and do that, as much as possible.
So are you speaking mainly in Japanese during the day with the team, or in English, or do you mix it up?
Well, it's a mix, and it depends on who the person is. I mean, some of the staff have their English is much better than my Japanese, so I'm happy to talk in English, and others don't speak as much English, so I'll speak Japanese. So it really depends on who I'm talking to.
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. And I've asked a lot of questions around leadership, but are there any areas that I haven't asked questions about, or any areas we haven't discussed about leadership which you think might be relevant?
Well, I think leadership in Japan, I'll make a comment about that. And I think it's interesting in Japan. I think when leaders come to Japan, the Japanese will, cut them a bit of slack from the perspective of they don't know Japan and the customs and how things work. However, after you're here for a period of time, and that period of time will vary, I guess, depending on the person and the situation, they do expect you to understand how things work in Japan and get on board with it. So I think it's important to understand that initially it can be very, as a leader, you might think, oh, it's going well, but that's because the Japanese around them are, funneling things away from them because they're not aware of how it works in Japan. So you need to understand that, over a certain period of months, you need to get on board with and understand the customs in Japan, and you can't go forever having stuff funneled around you because you're the foreigner that doesn't understand.
And I guess in a lot of cases too, leaders in Japan talk about the Japanese decision-making system is sort of top-down but also bottom-up. It's quite a confusing mix where directives happen that this will now be doing this, so that's sort of top-down. But there's also, at a sort of concrete level, before the actual meeting with all the different groups on something or other, before that, people are scurrying around having one-on-one meetings, trying to get them on board to support a particular idea. And so it becomes a bit of like a sort of a signing ceremony type of thing by the time you get to the meeting room. It's already been decided. This is just the sort of formal agreement in public that something's been privately agreed is now going to be a reality. Are you sort of the very top-down directive leader and you're telling them, okay, this is what's going to happen? Or are you allowing the sort of bottoming up process as well in terms of influencing the decisions?
And I think that depends on the decision. Mm-hmm. As an example, the strategy for our division comes from the top, and there's no negotiations around that. There can be some creative thinking around the strategy and stuff like that we can change it slightly maybe, but that's pretty much a non-negotiable decision that comes from above. But decisions that are more local decisions, I certainly do engage with people and we'll get feedback one-on-one, and certainly we'll adjust things based on that feedback. That when we do get to the meeting, I know I've got supportive people who are in the room and I've got feedback from people who are in the room, and happy to take that feedback, because I think that 10 people make a better decision than one person if you've got the right, the subject matter experts in the room on the, to make a decision about, whatever subject it may be. And I tend to take that input and action it. Because
some leaders mentioned to me that when they first got here, they'd call a meeting and they'd make some decisions, finish the meeting, and expect that what was agreed would be executed. And then at some point, what they thought was agreement in the meeting actually was revealed not to be agreement at all. and the people responsible for that execution piece are just not doing it. And it's like, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Have you had these sorts of experiences?
None jump to mind, but I certainly, if I had a meeting and there was actions coming out of the meeting, I certainly would ensure that there was action owners and that I would have distributed something to everyone that was in the meeting to say, here's the actions that came out of that meeting, and here's the action owners for those actions, to ensure that there was, number one, someone taking responsibility and moving it forward, and that we had an understanding of what was agreed. And I tend to do that when I'm talking with the managers in the office here, to ensure that we're all on the same page.
And you're following up with that because sometimes, you think, oh, point A, point B, this is the obvious way to do it. And when you've delegated to someone, they've decided that actually point C is where we're going to go with it. And then you suddenly realise, hang on a minute, we're completely going off track here. And if you realise that quite close to the deadline or at deadline, it's a nightmare to try and fix it. So how do you ensure that you've got that common understanding without micromanaging people to death?
Yeah, I mean, usually when we've got an action, we'll put a date on the action. And again, depending on what the action is, sometimes there might be an action around submission to the regulator, for example. Everyone's very clear on, we'll have an internal submission deadline, which will maybe be a week ahead of the actual submission deadline. And we certainly try and follow up with people to make sure that they're, number one, working on it, number two, not having any issues in relation to it, because you don't want to find that out a week from submission. So I guess I don't try and micromanage, but I certainly try and get a feel for any areas that may be having issues or challenges, and try and work with them to try and smooth the road, to make it easier for them to get the job done.
Are you finding anything, I don't know what the complexion of the team is in the sense of age diversity, but for a lot of people, they're telling me that they're noticing that the younger staff are quite different in terms of what they're looking for in a career to older staff, and so they have to manage them quite differently. Do you have that sort of different split here, or are they mainly all in the same similar age bracket?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of younger people here, to be honest. So I don't have anyone in their 20s, and I probably have staff from sort of mid to late 30s. So
it's probably got a greater consistency of age and stage in terms of their careers and thinking. So it's probably in that sense a bit more uniform in terms of leading them. Anything else we haven't covered you think would be relevant for leading in Japan?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, Japanese people are they're not dissimilar to Australians at the end of the day, which might sound like a strange comment to make, but after being here for, over 20 years now, I think that there's a lot of similarities between Australians and Japanese, and
Or is that because you've become more Japanized?
Well, maybe that's partly I've become a little bit more Japanese as well. But the Japanese like to do a good job. They really do have pride in their work, and I think that's something that we have in Australia. And they also have a good, good friendship, which I think we have in Australia as well. So I think there are some similarities there, and I think any manager that comes to Japan, you need to focus on what's similar rather than what's different, and build from there. And, as you get here longer, as I have done, I've probably changed my thinking, and, I think you also need to be open to to change yourself when you're here, because, it's Japan, and you've got to take the good parts of the culture on board, and, hopefully end up being a better person at the end of the day.
So in addition to that, if we were going to give somebody who has been given a posting to Japan, probably because of tax reasons, between 3 and up to probably 5 years as an expat, and they're going to run a Japan operation for their company and their industry, no matter what it is If you were going to pick out three, in addition to what you've just said, if you're going to pick out a couple of pieces, say 3 pieces of advice for them as newbies to Japan, what would be some advice you'd give them?
I would say learn Japanese. And I know learning Japanese when you're working is challenging, but I think Japanese are very good. When you're learning Japanese initially, you can say 1 or 2 words and they'll say, oh, your Japanese is so good. They like it when foreigners speak Japanese or make an effort to learn Japanese. So start with something simple like get a good introduction in Japanese, and then build on that the introduction is initially of yourself, and then build it out to an introduction of yourself and your company, and just, build it out like that generally. And, I never thought I'd be here for over 20 years. If I hadn't started learning Japanese at the beginning, I could be sitting here now with no Japanese. So if you learn Japanese from day one and you end up being here 20 years, you're probably going to end up with good Japanese. So I think that's important.
Yeah, what else?
Other things for foreigners coming here to manage, I guess don't get caught up so much in the expat type of lifestyle. Lots of foreigners come here and, they, get stuck between the American club in Hiro and Roppongi. But, I think there's a lot of value in the normal Japanese lifestyle. I think a lot of people that have been here a long time enjoy the normal Japanese lifestyle. And there's value in that. So don't get caught up in the expat.
The gaijin ghetto.
Yeah, the gaijin ghetto. I think
yeah.
If you can speak Japanese and you can, live in the Japanese suburbs, you will have a more enjoyable experience over a longer period of time if that's what takes place.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. This
Thank you.
has been a great opportunity to hear what's been happening with the Commonwealth Bank here in Japan. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews, and please join us for our next episode.